In the days when Judah's hills were green and terraced, when cisterns were cut into rock and towers punctuated the borders, a king rose whose name meant, "The Lord is my strength." Uzziah, son of Amaziah, wore his youth like a banner and his resolve like armor. He was diligent, clever, and astonishingly capable. Under his hand, the southern kingdom prospered. Walls were reinforced, engines of war devised, vineyards tended, and the land sang with harvest. His counselors whispered that the blessing was visible, that wisdom and favor had braided themselves into his reign. He listened. He built. He commanded. And the people breathed easier under skies that seemed to promise stability. There is a hush in every palace corridor at dawn, an echoing half-light where ambitions sound like footsteps and decisions feel heavier than stone. Uzziah often walked there, measuring the silence, measuring himself. Success had become the architecture of his days. Every gate held, every field yielded, every charted line of defense was sharpened like a spear point. He loved the geometry of governance, the crisp utility of plans that became reality. Yet the higher he ascended, the more the invisible edges pressed against him. The boundaries older than any wall, older than any throne. The temple stood a short distance from his its courts ordered, its rituals measured by generations. Priests had their tasks, Levites theirs, singers another. The incense rose like a quiet river, and lamps burned steadily as if keeping watch over a nation's heartbeat. There are things assigned, some for kings, some for priests, some for those who cultivate fields, some for those who steward holy things. In Judah, the difference was not academic, it was covenantal, an old woven thread that held together identity and mercy. As victories stacked and praise gathered like grains in storehouses, something subtle shifted. Pride does not announce itself. It loosens one strand, then another, until the garment of humility sits just a little differently on the shoulders. One morning, whether born of sincere impulse or creeping presumption, Uzziah decided that the incense, that sweet offering, would be fittingly tended by the hand of the one whom the Lord had strengthened. He entered the temple courts with confidence familiar to him, bearing a censer as though another duty of the realm awaited completion. High priest Azariah moved swiftly, attendants in tow, sorrow written in the lines of his face. He spoke with urgency and reverence. "This is not for you, O king." The words were not a rebuke to authority, but a defense of order, a guardrail around the sacred. He named the ancient boundary, reminded the king of the priestly calling, urged restraint at the very edge where holiness begins. In the candle-lit air, incense smoldering, attention gathered. The king stood steady, the priest stood firm. The line between zeal and arrogance thinned to a breath. We are told that in that contested moment, something appeared on Uzziah's forehead, an affliction that spoke more loudly than any argument. It marked him with isolation. The censer did not fall and shatter, the lamps did not dim, but the room was forever different. He was hurried out, not by his own command, but by necessity, removed from proximity to what he had sought to touch. The halls of the palace would still remember his steps, but they would grow fewer. The protocols of the court would still bear his seal, but they would be signed in a house set apart. He lived out his days apart, a king with doors closed around him, having crossed a threshold no throne can override. Leprosy is not merely a disease in ancient words, it is a loneliness given a name. Uzziah's story turns on that pivot where capability meets calling and power meets limits. Prosperity had been a gift, innovation a blessing, strategy a wisdom. None of this was stripped from the memory of his reign. Canals still carried water. Towers still watched horizons. Fields still bore fruit. But a quietness seeped into the narrative. A caution that traveled farther than his borders, whispered in court schools and sung in temple lessons. It said that strength must kneel, that blessing must not presume, that the holy remains holy regardless of the hands that have accomplished much. In the margins of chronicles, scribes sometimes press their pens harder when recording turning points. One such scribe, careful and resolute, inscribed that Uzziah was cut off from the house of the Lord, not exiled from the land, nor dethroned by enemies, but edged out from proximity to the sacred flame. The words feel like winter frost, a crystallized note that chills even as it clarifies. We see a king's room prepared in a separate house. We hear decisions passed to another's hand, and we sense the ache of distance between a man and the worship he attempted to command. There is mercy even in boundaries. There is kindness in the structure of callings. The priesthood's charge was not invented by men, nor was kingship an unchecked appetite. Each was an entrusted stewardship, held beneath a higher sovereignty. Uzziah's affliction did not erase the good he had done, nor did it excuse the fracture that came from assuming what was not his to assume. When we remember him, we see both the architecture of his wisdom and the closed doors of his later years, standing together like twin pillars in a lesson that will not fade. What does a nation learn from such a story? That competence is not consecration, that excellence is not entitlement, that the closer one comes to the holy, the surer one must be that the approach honors the path appointed. We can till fields and raise fortifications, we can write codes and balance coffers, and yet still be called to stop at the threshold where incense burns and admit that another has been chosen to tend that flame. By the time Uzziah's days concluded, Judah's map bore the imprint of his foresight, but its song held a minor key, a remembrance that strength can stumble when boundaries blur. The scribes closed the scroll with honest ink. The temple kept its rhythm. The people, prone to forget and destined to remember, carried the tale forward. A king who was mighty, a king who was limited, a man whose name declared the Lord as strength and whose life insisted that even strength must bow. If you walk ancient stone corridors at dawn and listen for footsteps, you might hear the echo of his. They move with purpose, then pause at an unseen line. Beyond that line, lamps burn as they have always burned. Within the line, a lesson rests. The sacred is safest when honor keeps its watch, and prosperity is sweetest when humility remains its keeper.